for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in June 1944, 2 weeks after the D-Day landings in Normandy, President Franklin Roosevelt signed the Servicemen's Readjustment Act, more commonly known as the GI Bill. That landmark measure created both college tuition grants and a living stipend for returning service members who, according to FDR, quote, had been compelled to make greater economic sacrifice and every other kind of sacrifice than the rest of us. Even though World War II would rage on for another year, leaders in Washington at the time recognized that millions of drafted young soldiers, sailors, Marines, and airmen would soon be returning to civilian life, and for their sake and the sake of the post-war economy, creating an educational pathway to the middle class made tremendous sense. It has been 74 years since the GI Bill was signed into law, and it is now recognized as one of the most successful pieces of domestic legislation ever enacted. The post-war economic boom of the 1950s and 60s and the blossoming of the American middle class both have been attributed in part to the GI Bill. Many renowned Americans, including Bob Dole, Johnny Carson, Harry Belafonte, Justice William Rehnquist, and even Clint Eastwood, to name just a few, were beneficiaries of the GI Bill. Economic studies have concluded that for every dollar the U.S. government spent on the GI Bill, our economy saw nearly $7 in return in the form of additional economic output and tax revenues from income growth. Despite its stellar performance, the relative strength of the GI Bill deteriorated over time. By 2008, it was clear that the tuition assistance and living stipends had not kept pace with the rising costs of college education. As a freshman congressman on the House Armed Services Committee, I heard from Iraq and Afghan veterans that because of the GI Bill erosion, they were forced to choose between dropping out of school or shouldering the burden of student loans. To fix this inequity, the post-9/11 GI Bill was passed by a Democratic Congress on a bipartisan basis and signed into law by a Republican President, George W. Bush. And I want to actually take a moment to publicly acknowledge that the late Senator John McCain was deeply involved in the final negotiations that made that passage and enactment successful. The updated law increased benefits to match the cost of four-year public university tuition in a service member's home state, and increased the living stipend to keep faith with the law. And critically, it also allowed GI benefits to be transferred on a one-time basis to a spouse or dependent child, a groundbreaking change that transformed the value of military service. After the bill signing, I flew to Iraq on a congressional visit and vividly recall being in Baghdad surrounded by hundreds of soldiers bursting with questions about when and how this feature would be implemented. Over the last 10 years, it has been clear that the transferability of the GI Bill benefit has had an enormous morale booster and a valuable incentive to enlist and remain in service. Despite the 10 years of success of the new law, however, the Trump Department of Defense announced a new policy this past July 12th that would bar service members with more than 16 years of service from transferring their post-9/11 GI benefits to eligible family members. And Mr. Speaker, I just want to say, as someone who represents a military district, in the August break when I was home visiting the submarine base in New London and talking to Guard and Reserve members, they were absolutely blindsided, stunned, and angry at this arbitrary change that many of them had built their career decisions about staying in the military to basically qualify for this educational benefit. The Iraq and Afghan Veterans of America have started a national petition drive to reverse this policy change, and really it is our duty as members of Congress to make sure that that is successful. Arbitrarily revoking transferability breaks our commitment to our most dedicated and highly trained service members. Such a policy change sends exactly the wrong message to those who have chosen the military as their long-term career and sets a damaging and dangerous precedent for the removal of other critical benefits to our all-volunteer force. 2 weeks after the Pentagon announced this policy, 83 of my colleagues joined me in a letter that we sent to Secretary of Defense James Mattis objecting to this change and calling for its immediate reversal. So far, they have not given a single public explanation for this policy change, and they are promising that it's coming. But I will just say this, as someone who was involved when this bill was first passed, we will make sure there will be a legislative response if the Department of Defense does not keep faith with those who wear the uniform of this country and who have volunteered based on the reliance of the fact that there would be a GI Bill benefit for them and their spouse and children. To use FDR's words, protecting transferability, quote, gives emphatic notice to the men and women in our armed forces that the American people do not intend to let them down. I yield back the balance of my time.